partner also at the Akin law firm, and he will be your fearless moderator for this panel. So without further ado, over to you.
All right, thank you, Don. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. We're really looking forward to having an educational and entertaining panel. So I actually want to introduce my distinguished colleagues here on the panel. As you're going to hear briefly from them, this is a very experienced and well-learned group. And so I want to actually start by letting them quickly introduce themselves. Allison, do you want to start?
Is this thing on? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Skopec. I am an attorney at Holland & Knight in New York, and my background is in maritime law. I went to Tulane and did the whole maritime curriculum, and I've tried to merge new technology, typically maritime, into my practice. I also helped found a Maritime Law Association committee with my coworker, Sean Pribble, devoted to exploring automation in the maritime industry.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Weigel. I'm an attorney with Blank Rome in New York. I'm a member of the firm's maritime practice. My practice is primarily casually related, but we also do a lot of regulatory work, including in autonomous surface ships and also autonomous underwater vehicles. My background, besides being an attorney, is I spent 24 years in the Navy driving submarines and also working with our unmanned vehicles detachment here in San Diego, which is where I got the experience that bringing to bear here today.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kirk Foster. I'm an attorney with a company called HII Mission Technologies. We rebranded a few years ago. HII stands for Huntington, Ingalls Industries. You may know us by our shipyards. In Newport News, we are the only builder of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. We also build one of two companies that build nuclear-powered submarines. We have a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where we build other ships for the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. I work for Mission Technologies, which is our government services division. I'm the director of compliance and privacy. And among other government services, we build small unmanned submersible vehicles that we sell to the Navy, to NATO countries, countries in Asia, as well as government agencies for environmental research and things like that. Prior to HII, I was a career Navy judge advocate for 28 years. Did 2 tours of duty here in San Diego, so the opportunity to come back is always welcomed. And I look forward to participating. Thank you.
Thank you. So with this distinguished panel, we're going to cover in this panel the legal regimes that cover land and sea vehicles. I know you've heard a lot about the air domain earlier today, and we're going to talk about the proliferation of certain types of land and sea autonomous vehicles and the legal regimes that apply to them. So we're going to launch right into it. I will say that our panelists, in my view, have been a little bit humble. Their bios are available online, and if you look at them, you will see they have had and are having very distinguished careers. So with that, let's launch right into it. And I think, Kirk, we'll start with you. So the last several years have seen a proliferation of all kinds of water-based vehicles, maritime autonomous surface ships, uncrewed underwater vehicles, remotely operated vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about the proliferation of these vehicles?
Sure, absolutely. And it's just been amazing, particularly in the last couple of years. However, I mean, for example, our company building just small unmanned vehicles, everything from maybe, there we go, some of our vehicles there, the Remus. These things can be, multiple types of packages can be placed on them for intelligence gathering, reconnaissance equipment. There are much larger vehicles that are under construction, not by our company, but by others, that eventually will be not launched from a ship, like a destroyer or a Coast Guard cutter or some other smaller vessel, but will actually leave from the pier. And we're talking about vehicles potentially 80 feet in length or more. And they would just submerge and go west or east, depending. And they will have compartments that you can put stuff into. And whether it's divers or equipment that could be launched to do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or just those sorts of vehicles. I mean, it's a whole new world that is being developed. The question will become eventually, and we were discussing this just a few minutes ago, is if a vehicle is that size, submersible, 80 feet in length, or an unmanned surface vehicle operating with other ships, can they eventually be designated a warship and receive the protections that a warship would get, as opposed to being a piece of gear deployed from a larger vessel? Do they have their own sovereignty, if you will? So instead of it being in the South China Sea and China just grabbing it as a piece of gear, like a fishing net, well, if they grab that unmanned vehicle and it's designated a warship, what does that mean? What does that entail? So those are the things that I think folks should be thinking about and considering as we move forward in this brave new world.
Yeah, you've segued perfectly in my next question. So, and as a land lover, I'm learning quite a bit. So my background is entirely in land vehicles, and some of us are familiar with the NHTSA levels of autonomy that are being developed, I would say, to cover land vehicles. So, Allison, if I could direct the next question to you, is there kind of similar levels of autonomy that govern water-based vehicles?
Yeah, they definitely have been reflected in the maritime world. And the main governing body is the International Maritime Organization, and they were founded, I think, around 1948. They're a UN body, and they essentially were founded to create a governing group for all maritime-related issues, whether it be like regulation on an international level. So through them, they were founded in 1948, but everything prior, basically, so like, for example, they have a convention called the Safety of Life at Sea that became promulgated after the Titanic sank in 1914. So when IMO was founded, they now, can modify any prior existing treaty or law, or if anything needed to be founded after the fact of IMO being founded, such as like mass-related stuff, that would have happened after. Clearly, like, they didn't have that kind of technology that long ago. So the IMO can either create new stuff related to mass, or they can modify old treaties. So when it comes to mass-related work, they have developed 4 degrees of autonomy. I think we have a slide on it. Thank you. Perfect. So for degree 1, that is if you have seafarers on board and it's fully operated and controlled by crew, literally on the vessel, but there may be an automated process. And really today, every ship has some level of automation on it. The example I can think of right now, when the Ever Forward grounded in the Chesapeake Bay a few years ago, and I actually got to climb on board. I went on a very tiny boat out to the very big boat in the middle of the Chesapeake, and then climbed up a tiny rope ladder to get on board, and we pulled all of the ECTAS material, and they were like, "What are you doing here?" I was like, "I'm a lawyer." And they were like, "Okay." And then there were certain things already on that boat, I guess, as a case study. Like, ECTAS is a navigational software, and so what now is like public information, and I can talk about, the Coast Guard did a whole investigation, and it came down to the fact that in that particular channel, you're required to have a pilot on board that is compulsory and like actually knows the geography of that area. So any cargo ship going through the Chesapeake, they have to then have a pilot come on board for that channel. This is also quite common around the world, in like the Philippines and Australia. And so in this particular example, the pilot ended up being on his phone at a crucial moment when he should have been following the ECTAS guidance. And that is an automated function on the ship. And because he was distracted by his phone, they ended up grounding, and it took many weeks to get that ship up. And in fact, even the full moon actually helped the tide rise enough. But it was like, operationally a very expensive thing that could have been avoided. And so like, that's one example of an automated degree 1 autonomy that could have been, better implemented at the time. And then degree 2 of autonomy, you have people on the vessel, but it could be remotely operated in another location. And then degree 3, that would be if remotely controlled without any seafarers on board. Recently, a group called Mayflower 400, they did an entirely autonomous vessel on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower coming over, and they completed a journey across the Atlantic, and that would have been considered a degree 3 automation. And then degree 4 is completely autonomous, no one on board. The ship is essentially a free-thinking entity, and there aren't as many controls involved. So those are the 4 levels of automation that are commonly accepted at the IMO level, and I know we'll talk more in detail about the US and domestic framework, but literally the US is now copying everything happening at the IMO. So that's a quick background on that.
And so Allison, so who or what entity or governing bodies govern vehicles that fall into these different degrees of autonomy?
Well, it would be the IMO is the big group. Like, I feel like today everything will be like, look back at the IMO, because they are the big international group doing that kind of work. Mm-hmm. And then each flag state, like in the US, the main entity is the Coast Guard doing automation. And actually, I think in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, they actually had a carve out telling the Coast Guard to start doing policy work. And so far, they've only made one letter, policy letter, the Coast Guard. So they're kind of...
They're getting into it.
They're getting into it. It's still very early, but they are laying the groundwork and have gotten government backing on that.
Understood. All right, thank you, Allison. So let's contrast that then with land vehicles. Alan, obviously we're seeing many, many more EVs on the roads. Can you talk to us a little bit about the levels of autonomy that govern vehicles on the road and whether there's any such thing as fully autonomous these days?
Yeah, so the levels of autonomy for what are called automated driving systems. That's the new technology, the new terminology. And at least today, that's the new terminology. I'm sure next week we'll have some new term to use. It's similar to the, there's a lot of parallels here between ships and cars. And the levels of autonomy have been established under the Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in conjunction with the Society of Automotive Engineers. And they have basically 6 levels of autonomy, and you're all familiar with them if you have a car that has lane assist or brake assist. So the first 3, 0, 1, and 2, are basically what you have today in your car, that if you get too close to the car in front of you, it'll yell at you. Your car will yell at you and may even slam on your brakes without you're doing it. I have an old car, so I don't have this. I just rented an auto because my car was in the shop and it had lane assist, and I was basically driving down the Jersey Turnpike, and I said, let's do an experiment. I'll take our hands off the wheel, and sure enough, back and forth, it keeps in the lane. Now so that's basically the first 3 levels of autonomy that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has established. Then we have levels of autonomy that don't require either a driver in the driver's seat but not required to drive the car, or no driver required under either very limited conditions or unlimited conditions. And those are the 6 levels that are currently being considered or being used by the federal government in their plans for automated driving systems.
Thanks, Alan. So we're all lawyers up here. We're all interested in the legal paradigm that covers these vehicles. And for land vehicles, I think from our experience, we know it's a complicated question, to say the least, right? You have kind of a federal system, and then you have states going off and doing things on their own. And so, Alan, can you talk to us a little bit about that too? What is the federal paradigm here? What, if there is one? And then can you tell us a little bit about what the states are doing as well?
Yeah, so they're really, I don't want to badmouth our federal government, but like any bureaucratic organization, I mean, you heard the same thing from Allison about the Coast Guard, how we have autonomous surface ships and underwater ships, and we have no Coast Guard regulations. We have no IMO regulations really that govern them. It's the same thing with automated driving systems. The federal government has what they call let me just make sure I got this right, a comprehensive plan for automated driving systems. Yeah, right. What they've basically done is they've issued 3 publications of varying degrees of talking about various aspects of automated driving systems. And the one that's of most interest really is version 2.0, which basically establishes some voluntary performance standards for how automated driving systems should operate. And as I said, they're voluntary. So what their government's now doing, they've put this out, I guess the most recent version of this comprehensive plan was 2019. So really nothing has happened in that regard since 2019, except for both the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Federal Motor Carrier Commission announcing that they're going to engage in what's called rulemaking. So there have been advance notices of proposed rulemaking in from both those agencies. But the rulemaking is only not to establish rules, but to ask the public, tell us what framework we should apply when we finally find rules to govern these systems. So it's very, very early in the process. On the other hand, the states, having completely ignored the federal government, are now just doing it on their own. Now, the federal government has said in their comprehensive plan that they really want to take the lead on regulating automated driving systems. And you have to understand that that's probably a good idea, ultimately, because if we're going to drive these things across state, or have them driven across state lines, we really need to have some uniform rules around the country. You can't have one state saying, well, I don't like the way, Arizona, I don't like the way California is regulating automated driving systems, so you can't bring any of them into my state. So you'd be very insular. And that doesn't really work with our federalist system very well. So even though the federal government has told the states that they really want to be at the forefront, the states aren't waiting. There's apparently, I think, 19 states now that have some form of automated driving system, either regulation or statutes that cover them, or are testing them, or actually operating them. The 2 biggest areas are Texas and California. Texas is very, very advanced in the trucking industry, and they have been testing and operating 18-wheeler automated driving systems, and I think that they're going to lead the way in terms of how we move logistics across the country in an automated fashion or an autonomous fashion. California, on the other hand, is really taking the lead on driverless cars, vehicles that carry passengers. And I think that they've done, there's an organization called the Uniform State Commission. They basically put together what are used around the country for various different kinds of laws. They proposed, this is a Uniform Autonomous Vehicles Act. And it says, this is how if you're a state, this is how you should set up your automated vehicles statutes. California looked at that and said, nah, we don't. Most states are following those, the ones that are doing the testing. California, on the other hand, looked at that and said, that doesn't really do it for us. We have a much more robust, in this state, a much more robust set of rules and regulations for both testing and eventually deploying automated driving systems. And I really think that this is far and away better than anything that's being done anywhere else, because what they've basically done, whereas the federal government has in their comprehensive plan a set of voluntary performance standards, which are at least better than nothing but are fairly vague, California has said, no, we want you, the automated driving system manufacturer, tell us, how does your system react to various circumstances. And there's a whole list of things that they have to certify in order to get permission to test. And then after you've tested, you have to then go back to the government here in California and say, all right, we've tested, and here is how it's performed. And then they can get permission to deploy your automated driving system on the California roads beyond just limited test opportunities.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what happened with data privacy, where the federal government didn't really have the will to pass comprehensive legislation for whatever reason, and the states stepped in and started implementing these individual standards, and maybe that is the impetus that then forces the federal government, exactly as you say, to pass kind of governing legislation to iron out the differences amongst the different states.
I'm not sure where Dawn wrote this, but she's told me a couple times that risk holds back regulators. I said, maybe it's in your textbook, I don't know. But that's very true. I mean, but you can see this in the Coast Guard with the autonomous vessels, and you can see it with the federal government in automated driving systems, that they don't understand the risks. So because they don't understand the risks, they're not willing to commit to any kind of regulations. And I think that is what the industry has to deal with, is demonstrate the way California has asked their automated driving system manufacturers to demonstrate, show us that you have considered the risks and how your system will address the risks. And I'm hoping that now that California is doing it, other states will do it. And I'm also hoping that the Coast Guard will look at what California is doing in that regard and say, oh, maybe that's the way we can certify autonomous vessels, and say, all right, here's a checklist, show me that you comply with the checklist, and then we can certify you to go off and operate your system.
Excellent. So let's talk about that. So Allison, are we doing any better on the water-based side? Is there a legal paradigm there that we can rely on, that we can look to? What's the governing law for these vehicles in the water?
Well, I think often in the US we end up looking at our friends in Norway and Japan and Korea, because a lot of other countries have been quicker to adapt and embrace new technology. But I don't think it's a problem of like interest, or that people in the US don't want to embrace the technology. I think that the technology is developing much faster than regulators can keep up with. And I mean, that's also true for many other things. Like when the internet came about, like our laws on the books they've taken quite a long time. And even now, like in the copyright and intellectual property work I've done, it's still like early 2000s level regulation. So I think that it's a slow burn in the US. And the thing is, on the commercial end and the legal perspective that there are a ton of companies that are developing this technology and are working with regulators and lobbyists. And I think a lot of it too is like educating our Congress. Like the internet didn't exist for a lot of people currently in our government. And I think maybe there's like a hesitation, and it feels like science fiction in a way. But in terms of like maritime autonomous technology, like the earliest patent for a maritime autonomous vessel came out in 1898 when Nikola Tesla had a remote control battery operated. It was like a little boat, like a toy, but you know, it's not like a new idea. That's quite old. And I think that like we're gonna have to keep having conferences. So thank you, Don, for that. And like, you know, bringing people together and treating it like interdisciplinary, and not just looking at, here we have a boat, and then we have a drone, and then we have rail. But in the shipping industry, you know, it's intermodal. Like the cargo container revolutionized the way that we live in the world today. And I think having a holistic approach to that, and being like, these are not all separate things. Like in terms of like maritime, it could be like the applications of autonomous technology could be applied to offshore wind. So we can look at, you know, what people have done in Norway and the North Sea, and then apply that to like Block Island and Rhode Island, and then look at what startups are coming about. Like there's one company called Sail Drone, and they are creating USVs that specifically can handle the really rugged conditions of going out to an offshore wind farm. And in that way, it's not like a fear of the new, but helping improve safety for mariners and it's not taking away jobs, but actually like improving quality of life, lowering like risk and making things safer for everyone. So,
So picking up on that point, so as maritime vessels are able to travel farther from shore, right, you have additional complications since you have distinctions between domestic and international, or territorial and international waters. So can you explain that distinction a little bit? And then what rules apply to international waters?
yeah, so there are demarcations of territory, and that was established under the Law of the Sea Convention. So every coastal state has a 12 nautical mile territory that they can do whatever they want with that water, like from the air to the seabed. And then from there, after the 12 nautical miles, if it was actually, embraced, like the U.S. did claim that 12 nautical mile territory. Anything beyond that would be considered international waters. That's not like a legal term, that's just kind of the accepted terminology for it. But it can get a little dicey when there are territorial disputes, like looking at the South China Sea, which I'm not going to get into today. But yeah, beyond the 12 nautical miles, a lot of interesting questions come up about if you have an autonomous vessel, like you get into coal regs, so that's another IMO convention, collision regulations and safety. And what if you have a vessel out in like the territorial seas and there's a pirate attack? That's something I've been thinking about, like how would that even be classified with an autonomous vessel? Like, could an autonomous vessel be a pirate ship? Because the legal definition is there has to be some act of violence or detention. So let's say there's like a robot on board. It just leads to a lot of like unknown things. And another example I can think of is like a search and rescue operation, because you do have an obligation when you're at sea. If you're on the water and a distress call goes out to go help or aid, or what if an autonomous vessel actually is in distress? Are they going to be granted the same rights to enter a port and have like safe berth? So I feel like the more you start talking about it, the more hypotheticals come up. And
Sure, and we've
Yeah.
seen from the news, these are not hypothetical situations at all, right? You just need to look at the news. China, Russia, these things are happening now. Alan, do you want to talk a little bit about the domestic rules?
Sure. So, as Allison mentioned, the United States Coast Guard is the organization that regulates vessels in U.S. waters. And by and large, the United States follows most of the international conventions almost in, I think, I'm not sure of any international convention that's been passed by the IMO. Well, there are a couple maybe, that the IMO have passed that the United States hasn't implemented through implementing legislation. Most of them are not what we call self-executing treaties. So when the United States agrees to an international maritime treaty, then the Congress has to pass statutes to implement that, and then the Coast Guard passes regulations that implement the statutes. And so in all the cases, basically, for example, the collision regulations, manning regulations, safety regulations that are international conventions that the United States has agreed to, we have, and the Coast Guard has established their own regulations saying how that they will interpret those international treaties and what are required by U.S. vessels. I mean, for example, the United States is as party to the collision regulations, the international rules for the prevention of collisions at sea. And then the Congress has basically implemented statutory guidance to the Coast Guard saying, well, basically all they did was they said, here are the 1 through 35 collision regulations, and they are now part of U.S. law. And then the Coast Guard has passed a couple of other implementing regulations, and then they're the ones who basically, when you go aboard, they go aboard a ship and say, oh, did you follow that particular regulation? So it's all really, in the maritime law we have a concept, I mentioned it in terms of state regulation of cars, but in the maritime law we have a concept called uniformity. And there's a lot of effort in the United States and in the maritime bar and the maritime cases to say, well, we don't want to do things differently in the United States and in U.S. waters than are done around the world, because Again, we don't want to have ships sailing into our waters that don't follow the regulations, and we don't want to have ships sailing into our waters that have to follow some regulations that are the only place they exist are in the United States, because that would be basically an impediment to trade. And so that's why the United States embraces many of these maritime conventions, and that's why we pass the same implementing regulations in the United States.
Thank you. I want to ask you all about what you think are the hot topics that are arising in your respective areas. But before I do that, I'll just say, I'm sure if you have questions, you don't need to wait until the end. You can raise your hand. It's a good opportunity to ask this distinguished panel your questions. So if you have specific ones, please feel free to do that. But otherwise, we're going to move on to just your thoughts about what in your respective areas are you seeing? Like what are the developments? What are the challenges that you see now that are important to you in your practices and to the future development of law in both maritime and land?
Well, thank you. A couple of thoughts come to mind. Oh, there was a question over there? Yes, ma'am.
No. The video can't hear you.
Unlike the previous panels where we've heard from Holland and Knight and other legal teams, where they're trying to prevent preemption and working together with the community at large to not have states take ownership of from a blade of grass up, it almost sounds like you're looking for the states to take a leadership role because the regulatory posture is so behind, so you're not fighting the preemption issue. So it seems completely the antithesis of what's going on in the aviation arena.
And this is for the EV world, I would assume, automated driving systems.
Yeah, well, okay, so the reason they're already, the federal government already does have traffic laws, have implemented traffic safety laws and highway safety laws. So I think it's inevitable that the federal government is going to regulate, and I think states have their own, but they're generally, for example, the federal government has established that all cars have to have seatbelts, okay? States don't have the ability to say, well, we don't want seatbelts. You don't have to have seatbelts in our cars. They follow the same laws. At the same time, the states also don't implement regulations to say, well, you have to have different seatbelts than what the federal government says you have to have. And I think that's what we're trying to do in autonomous driving systems, and say eventually want the federal government to establish the regulations, and then the states say, well, in order to register your autonomous driving system in our state, you have to follow their law would only say, in order to register the autonomous driving system in our state, you have to comply with the federal government standards. So that's the way we want to do it for autonomous driving systems, and I think it's going to be the same. Allison will probably have the same comment.
Just quickly following up on that, is it fair to say that one of the reasons you're looking for the states to step in is because of the vacuum at the federal level? In other words, you might prefer a federal system, but frankly, there isn't one.
There isn't one. I would prefer a federal system, but it's just inevitable that because the federal government is going so slow, and technology is proceeding so fast, and we're in a state right now that, Silicon Valley is one of the technology centers of the whole world. That's generally why I think you see California embracing this new technology as quickly as it is, and hopefully that the federal government will say, all right, we understand that's the way California is doing it, and that's not a bad way to do it, and we're going to embrace that, and we'll get off the dime and start doing it. But like many bureaucratic organizations that have to go through the whole Administrative Procedures Act, the proposed notice of rulemaking and public comment periods, and it takes a long time to do it.
Well, and you're seeing cities step in.
Right. We even that's
San
right.
Francisco,
Cities do this.
Yeah.
And, like I said, in the comprehensive plan, it says that the federal government would prefer to take the lead, but obviously, if you're not leading, someone else is going to say, "Get out of the way, we'll lead," and that's what's happening right now.
I did want to make sure that Kirk had a chance.
Thank you, and I'm a fan of preemption. As a privacy practitioner, we've got employees in 45 states. We got to deal with California privacy law, Virginia privacy, New York, Nebraska, and so everyone's got a different standard. And each state has a different standard when it comes to personal identification type information. So having a common standard, I think, is important. When you're talking the maritime realm, I think it's even more critical. As Alan was pointing out, you're doing international trade. You've got vessels coming and going. You've got folks operating the coastal areas. You've got fishermen. You've got luxury liners. You certainly don't want to send an unmanned submersible vehicle out there that doesn't have the equipment to avoid a collision, and then it takes out, you know, a Japanese boat full of tourists, like a U.S. Navy submarine did 10, 20 years ago out of Hawaii. So that's the last thing you want. So I think having those standards would be very, very helpful. Allison?
Yeah, I have a lot I want to talk about here, but I'll try to keep it brief. I don't think we've mentioned the pandemic yet at all, but COVID really tested everything with our supply chains. And I'm a litigator, but I also do regulatory work and transactional, because maritime, it could just be anything salty. But during COVID and even to today, my practice has shifted a lot to being more on the regulatory end because of everything that happened during COVID. Like, I'm sure everyone has a story of ordering a couch and it took like a year to show up or something like that. And so a lot of companies are really upset about, you know, the systems that we have in place that kind of were pressure tested during COVID. And so from the government end, there have been administrative agencies that have really stepped up and trying to figure out how to build up our infrastructure in a way that, you know, is threatened by COVID. So I've noticed personally the Federal Maritime Commission has really done like an accelerated notice of common rulemaking. They've done a lot for like transparency, accountability, and automation of like collecting data and stuff like that. So even though that's not directly related to autonomous technology, I think they all tie in together. And like I mentioned earlier, it's very much like an interdisciplinary thing. And I think, you know, states like Texas that are right on the Gulf they're not going to wait around for the federal government to do something. And so I think a lot of it will be like asking forgiveness and not permission with people, or innovators going out there and actually developing the technology. And then from there, you know, figuring out, is this Jones Act compliant, like dealing with CBP and all the, you know, the alphabet soup of different agencies. So for example, with offshore wind, that's Department of the Interior. So you're dealing with Department of Interior for permitting, but then for customs related stuff, you have to get approval from CBP. And then it's just like so many different things. And this is why, like, even after years of being a maritime attorney, I'm still learning new things every day, because you can go on the news and there's like a new, you know, the Baltimore Bridge happened. Like, there's every day something new happening. And I think that we can do our best to try to put systems in place to prevent risk and to make things safer and more streamlined with the supply chain. But a lot of it, we won't really know until we have a catastrophic event or something like that, and then figuring out like lessons learned from there.
So I'm going to ask a question that's maybe a bit dangerous, certainly difficult, but I'll ask it anyway. So look, we're heading to a hotly contested presidential election, Congress that's divided, to say the least, dangerous international, political, military, economic climate. Notwithstanding all of that, I want all of your thoughts on, so what do you think is going to happen in the next year? What do you see are the most kind of likely developments that will impact what we're talking about? Yes, sorry,
No,
I'm not
no,
asking
no.
for political commentary, just to be clear. Yes.
No, as far as regulation, I believe in smart regulation. It shouldn't just be an edict coming down from, frankly, the Coast Guard or from the federal government, but done in partnership. You know, they can work with the states, they can work with the shipping industry, they can work with the building manufacturers and come up with smart regulations to the extent practicable. So I think that's one of the themes that I'm hearing from my colleagues, is that there's a need for regulation, and I agree with that. The other thing I'm hearing is that technology is going to drive the train, and that the regulation is just going to be constantly catching up. So I'm going to give you something I've been thinking about, past, present, and future. Hopefully gets to your question. You know, a little over 100 years ago, we were in the First World War. The dreadnought or the battleship, they were the king of the sea, right? 25 years later, along came the aircraft carrier. Battleships were relegated to basically escort duty and bombing islands. Aircraft and submarine was present in both. Pernicious almost brought Great Britain to its knees in both wars, just because of its ability to sink shipping. Technology advanced. Aircraft carriers developed nuclear propulsion. The weapon systems changed from propeller-driven to jet aircraft. Submarines changed from conventional diesel to nuclear. In some cases, weapon systems changed from torpedoes to rockets and missiles, and now ballistic missiles. A lot of money. The last aircraft carrier, and my company builds them, so please don't record this piece. $13 billion for that aircraft carrier. Okay? Nuclear submarine, very, very expensive. The last couple of years, what have we seen? Ukraine using drones very effectively against Russian tanks and armor, using semi-submersible drones to deny access to the Russian Navy in parts of the Black Sea. Russia now using Iranian-built drones, the Shahed, $20,000 a drone. Houthis, basically a unlawful group, has, I won't say shut down, but certainly is hindering trade through the Gulf of Aden, impacting the supply chain. And probably all of us are paying something extra. Shipping is going all the way around Africa instead of through the Suez. And just a week or so ago, we saw what Iran did with its nearly 200 drones. But there's defenses right now, right? There's aircraft defenses, missile defenses, because they're still being kind of sent almost just as drones, just launched at a target. Question becomes, what if the technology gets to the point with artificial intelligence that now, instead of sending 1 or 2 drones at a time, you can send 500, and they're all being coordinated, and they're thinking as one collective, or 1,000 drones. What if the Chinese People's Republic Liberation Army Navy launches 1,000 coordinated drones at an aircraft carrier strike group? How long does it last? What if, and this is all just my weird fantasy world, Taiwan has 1,000 or 10,000 submersible drones just sitting in the Strait of Taiwan, ready to throw a switch when China decides to invade and send their fleet over. And they all get activated, and they're all thinking as one, and they're coordinated. So I think as great as the thought is in the current regulation of technology, folks have to start looking even further down the pipeline about what the impact of AI is going to be. We worry about AI in our company. You know, how is it being used by our attorneys or used within development of products and services? But what is the impact of AI in the stuff that we're selling, you know? So I do think we need to start looking at that, because that day is coming. And whether we know it or not, or like it or not, I think we're in a technology race with other competitors, and it's either going to be used on us or we're going to have it to use first.
So in respect of automated driving systems, I think putting aside the politics involved, most of the bureaucratic groundwork was laid by the Department of Transportation in the last administration. The Department of Transportation, the current administration, has been more reactive, and you can read the news and you can tell why. I don't see whoever wins the election, I don't see that the Department of Transportation is really going to get a break from having to be reactive to the crisis of the day. So I think automated driving systems are going to take a lower priority. That's been the past 3 years, that as the example of the past 3 years, I don't think is going to change. So in terms of federal regulation of automated driving systems, I think you're going to see the same very slow pace. And you're going to see a much more rapid pace in regulation of automated driving systems by states. Whether or not the states finally get together and say, okay, we'll all adopt the same standard so that we can have the uniformity, so that Arizona can let the California automated driving cars drive across its state line, and Oklahoma can let the automated 18-wheelers in Texas deliver Amazon packages in Oklahoma City. That remains to be seen whether that's going to happen. Do we have time to talk a little bit about liability? Because I see that's the other issue.
We do.
I think that's
We
the other
do.
issue that's going
Yes.
to be very important. But we have a question first in the back.
Hold on, please.
Who's got the question?
I just had a quick question about the swarming technology. Does maritime have that ability for swarming? Because what you were describing with the drones was the swarm, and so. You know,
Someone's got to operate each individual drone. I don't think they have that technology yet to bring it all together. And that'll probably be artificial intelligence driven. And then that'll be driven by artificial intelligence, I think, and speculated. And then that's, I think, the game changer. I asked others. There's probably other folks that are more well-researched or well-read on that topic, but I just... there you go.
There you go.
I heard it here first, though.
Alan, can you talk a little bit about liability, and
Yeah.
then Allison, if you could do so for.
Yeah, I think that's the other big development we see on the horizon for automated driving systems, and that's the liability issue. Let me give you two examples of very well-publicized and somewhat horrific accidents. There was an accident with a Tesla in 2018 that resulted in a lawsuit. The driver of that vehicle was killed. Coincidentally, to follow on with the Ever Givens accident, the driver was on his cell phone playing a video game. And Tesla claims that they didn't certify that self-driving car for unattended operation. So that lawsuit was just settled, as a matter of fact, and so I don't really know. The settlement is confidential, so we don't know how much Tesla finally paid. But I think you're going to see a lot more of those kinds of cases as automated driving systems are involved in accidents. The DOJ, Department of Justice, has issued subpoenas to Tesla to just try to get to since the lawsuit didn't proceed, there's not really a good big public record, so the DOJ is investigating. The other case is the General Motors Cruise division's accident that happened here in California. A pedestrian who was hit by a car that had a driver was then hit again by a driverless vehicle. That case has not gone to a lawsuit yet. It was only happened in October of last year, and so I don't think they haven't gotten around to. I think the plaintiff in that case probably is waiting to see what happens with the California State Public Utilities Commission's investigation into the accident. General Motors has just offered to settle the fine that the Public Utilities Commission has had a hearing on, and that was just a hearing was just a couple of weeks ago. So I think you'll probably see more on that particular issue. There'll probably be a liability lawsuit, but that is what I see as the other future, unfortunately, of driverless automated driving system, driverless cars, driverless trucks, is that like any motor vehicle on the road, there's going to be accidents. And whether they're the fault of the driverless system, whether they're the fault of the manufacturer, whether they're the fault of the person operating it, that's all going to have to be played out. And there's going to be a lot of litigation, probably in the not too distant future on that.
Yeah, before I get into liability, just to feed into that, and how maritime vessels are not swarming in the way that you were talking about with drones. The big commercial issue right now in maritime law is scaling up, and how do you take autonomous technology, like most often now it might be a tugboat or a ferry, and like a lot of cities are now trying to get autonomous ferries and stuff like that. But when you think about how big a cargo ship is, that's a completely different scale. So like, you know, you're dealing with like something, if it were tipped over, like the Empire State Building tipped over, like you don't really realize how massive these container ships are until you're going up to one on a tiny tugboat feeling completely dwarfed. And a lot of companies are now dealing with that challenge of how do you scale up on that level. There have been cargo ships, like one in Japan, where they have created a fully autonomous vessel, but that's just one. And then on top of that, the maritime industry and stakeholders are kind of mixed on how they want autonomy to be implemented. So the CEO of Maersk, the biggest shipping company in the world, has said in his lifetime he doesn't expect that cargo ships will ever be fully autonomous. So tying into liability, there are a lot of unsettled things, and I think that will probably be the takeaway of our panel here. But with liability, you have the coal regs, and the coal regs require that a master be on board. Well, how do you define a master? Do you have a question? We'll give you the mic, don't worry.
Good afternoon. Just wanted to react to this question of liability. I'm working from French group Excel, which is manufacturing a navigation system, but also unmanned surface vehicle, and been deeply involved in the development of unmanned regulation for in Europe and mainly in France for maritime domain. And on the liability regime, we have also raised that topic several times during our discussion with the French Maritime Administration, and into the law that was passed recently to reform the French law to adapt it to unmanned surface vehicles. They found a solution to create a legal regime quite protective for USV operators, because it's a main question which is often raised by the crew, the uncrew which remain ashore, to ensure what is their risk when they are operating at distance all these new vehicles. And the solution that was found was to adapt the London Convention on Maritime Claim to create a financial cap to protect the liability of these operators, to ensure them that in case of claim they could face, their liability will not exceed a certain percentage of financial amount, which make it quite interesting, I think, and could be also used in other reflection from other countries if they are looking to ensure proper safety of their operators.
Yeah, thank you for that. So getting back into the definition of master, the coal regs require that a master be on board, but what if it's a completely autonomous vessel? Like, then that can lead to questions of insurance, and like if there's a catastrophic event, like what would the insurance coverage be? What insurers are willing to cover this kind of stuff? Like Lloyd's of London also has promulgated its own levels of autonomy with different levels of coverage. And then what if you have an autonomous ship flagged in Panama and the vessel was built, you know, in Singapore, and like you have all these like geopolitical and transnational issues that can come up if there's a collision, and like who do you blame? Do you blame the guy in the operation room in Boston that the vessel's in the middle of the Pacific? Like there's so many unknown liability issues that will probably just be figured out as they happen.
I have a question. We heard from the space panel that due regard is in the Outer Space Treaty, and I know that's also a term that is used in international law of the sea. Can you explain what the current issues are with due regard in autonomous vehicles in the maritime sector?
Yeah, with due regard, it's interesting because the space law is Article 3 under the Constitution, so that's all maritime law. And then space law is actually kind of piggybacked off of Article 3 with the moon would be covered by maritime law, anything on there. So it's very interesting from that level, but with due regard, I think it's kind of like a loose standard that it's kind of subjective in my opinion, and it's like a situation by situation approach. But yeah, with due regard, I think it would be a matter of like following the standards that are currently available, but then case by case kind of going with the flow on that. But I haven't run into due regard a whole lot, so.
I do want to leave a couple minutes for further questions, but quickly I would say, so in 30 seconds or less, just given the uncertainty and kind of the rapidly developing law in all of these areas, if you were to offer either a tip or a resource that our audience can rely on or at least incorporate into their thinking on these topics, not to put you all on the spot, but in any order, what would it be?
I'll take it from the last panel. Get your legal team involved early, especially if they're involved. If you're in the shipping industry, you want to find out from the maritime bar what are the latest rules and regulations about what you're trying to develop. If you're trying to develop that new technology that will help you navigate an unmanned vehicle, get with the regulators and find out what the latest and greatest is. Why create something that you're never going to get authorized to use and no one's ever going to buy? So I would say, make a bid for the lawyers, get them involved early in that planning process. Don't wait until it's too late.
So I think that I come at this with a slightly different perspective than a lot of people. We have in the United States a very big body of maritime law. We have a very big body of products liability law, and I think as it currently exists, it's more than adequate to cover autonomous systems. A lot of people say, but it's different. There's nobody at the helm. There's nobody driving the car. But in many places in the law, it doesn't say you have to have somebody at the helm or have to have someone driving the car. So I think we sort of maybe overthink the whole autonomous issue when it comes to legal liability and legal issues. And I think that all the case law that exists today could be very easily analogized to the automated autonomous systems without too much difficulty.
I feel like you both covered it really well, but I think trying to view it like having the lawyers, but knowing like when to get the engineers involved and like having all the different perspectives to create the product commercially, or from the legal team, you might need a transactional lawyer, you might need a regulatory attorney, like knowing all the different parties involved to pull together a great team when developing a product is key. And then I think my little plug for maritime law is like it literally can be anything. It could be the Suez Canal, or like what's happening now with diversions around the Horn of Africa. It is like geopolitical. Like the Biden administration has done a ton for infrastructure initiatives, but who knows, and very soon what will happen with that. So I think, viewing it as like a holistic deal where it's not just lawyers, it's not just scientists, but we all have to like come together to embrace new technology and not be fearful of it, and to use it in a way to improve quality of life and not view it as some big scary thing. It's already here. It's just a matter of, what are we going to do with it?
I think we all agree with you on that. So we do have a couple minutes for additional questions. And of course, you can certainly talk to the panelists afterwards. Oh, are we out of time? Yeah.
Just one question.
I'm just curious about something with regard to autonomy and scale, and particularly we've been talking about, for instance, container scale shipping vessels. I understand at the scale that I work at, and these are small UAS. You've got one pilot to one aircraft. It's a fairly low-cost aircraft. I understand the economies of autonomy in that context. I'm curious what the drivers are at the scale of
to accommodations and a galley and all that type of stuff. So if you could eliminate all that, you eliminate a big expense in a ship owner's life. So I think that's what on the other hand, there's just a sort of a sense of, do we really want 1,000-foot long ship barreling across the ocean without any people on board? I think once we understand that we're capable of doing that, and I don't think we're there today, or maybe it won't be there tomorrow, although I think the Maersk chairman's statement that it won't happen in his lifetime might be wrong. It certainly is happening today, but maybe not exactly at that scale. I mean, both in Europe and in the Far East, there are big ships being operated autonomously. Once we have some experience with that testing and we can show that it can be done safely, I think then you're going to start to see more and more commercial ships being operated autonomously.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, I think our time is up for today. Thanks so much for participating, for listening. Thanks very much to our panelists.